Hello everyone, welcome to the Frontline Club. Thank you for coming. Before I hand over to Jon Snow, if I can just ask you to switch your phones to silent. And when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone because we're broadcasting live. Over to Jon.
Assalamu alaikum. Well, I mean, there must be a few Arabs here. Who knows? Well, welcome everybody. And this is a really excellent opportunity because we're have in our midst somebody who's had an absolutely massive impact on media activity and political activity beyond. Wadah Khanfar is here, and of course you know what happens normally. You prepare for a frontline engagement with a famous person by going to Wikipedia. Damn it. So I thought we'd just spend the first few moments exploring his Wikipedia entry, but let him do the walking and the talking. So, born in Jenin, right? A Palestinian, but you don't go there. It's had it?
For a long time I haven't been there. Still, maybe the political situation did not really permit me to go back.
So, has Qatar been your home?
So far, yes, for the last 8 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, you joined Al Jazeera at an absolutely critical moment. You'd been in television before?
No.
Really?
The first job in journalism was with Al Jazeera.
And our first lesson is that the best television managers come from outside. That's interesting. A very rare experience in any transatlantic televisual activity. So you arrived at Al Jazeera, and what were your instructions?
I was started as a reporter from South Africa. My instructions was that you should become a correspondent. And I said, how? They said, just go to AP, they have a camera there. I went there, and the guy didn't understand exactly what I'm there for. So he said, okay, stand in front of the camera. I stood. He said, say something. I said, what am I going to say? He said, say anything. I said, okay, Nelson Mandela is a great man, and he's transforming South Africa into I was in South Africa at that time. He said, thank you very much. 1 minute is enough. And he sent this 1 minute to Al Jazeera Doha headquarters, and they phoned and they said, fantastic, the manager is happy with you. You are a correspondent.
Yeah. You have very good jaw for television. You know,
this
jaw is very, very
yeah.
important. Strong jaw is an important aspect for any television presenter. So how long did this front of camera stardom last?
I started actually, and then they phoned and they said, okay, start making reports. I said, about what? They said, choose 3-4 topics. So I started speaking about South Africa, transformation at that time, 1997, early 1997, education and all this kind of legacy of apartheid and so on. And then I discovered that this is a very interesting thing to do. And then I decided to buy my own camera, start shooting and filming and editing. And the first report I did myself, complete report, was about the floods in Zimbabwe, if you remember, 1998 or so. Yeah.
And
the floods of Mozambique.
Mozambique, yeah.
And then the farms in Zimbabwe.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. Yeah. I became a correspondent. And of course, before that, I was involved in political analysis. My background is, I am, at that time, analyst on African affairs. So I was working with a think tank in South Africa, Afro-Middle East Center for Research and Information, whereby, you know, my study was postgraduates in African studies. And this is how Al Jazeera got to know me, because they wanted someone to comment on events in South Africa and in Africa. And then they thought maybe I could become a good correspondent. And then I became a correspondent. Up to 2001, I continued in South Africa and the whole continent. In 2001, I found myself in Afghanistan, covering the war for about 6 months. And after that, I came back to South Africa. Then after that, I was asked to go cover the war in Iraq 1 year before, the whole thing started. I stayed in Iraq until 2003. The end of 2003, I became the bureau chief of Baghdad, after our bureau was destroyed, of course, by the Americans in 2003, early 2003. And then Al Jazeera was searching for managing director, and they appointed me a managing director.
You were a natural appointment. Anybody who could manage the bureau in Baghdad under American fire,
correct,
was going to be able to manage.
It was the biggest bureau for Al Jazeera anywhere overseas. We had about 102 employees. We had 20 of them in jail, and one of them was killed. and a few other people were, injured during that period, which is about 6 months after the beginning of the occupation. So the office itself was very vibrant. In Baghdad, maybe it was the most active office for any network because we had teams and the crews almost in every city and big town all over Iraq. And we managed a huge operation until the Iraqis got sick and fed up of us and they decided to close down the whole operation and kick us out.
Well, I was only in and out of Baghdad all that time, but we lived in admiration and awe of what you were doing. And I can see how it was a natural, that you would lead naturally to running Al Jazeera.
The most important factor in our coverage of Iraq that we depended on the people before Facebook and Twitter and everything else. This is exactly what happened because when I arrived in Baghdad Bureau, I couldn't find anyone. Most of our staff at that time were scattered actually because of the bombardment of the office and a lot of problems happened. So we started building team and we started bringing together some young guys, training them intensively for 2-3 weeks in the office, providing them with a small camera, mini DV cameras, and the Thuraya phone, spreading them around the country. So we had about 60 of these people all over the country, giving us initial reports. By the time they sent us the initial reports, we sent some professional journalists.
But you were already doing something which was quite counter to the Arab media culture. I mean, this was quite a Western kind of way of approaching the coverage of anything.
Al Jazeera started that from, the whole phenomena, or whatever you call it, Al Jazeera, is in fact against the custom and the tradition of journalism in the Arab world by that time. Because it started with different perspective about news. News before it used to be something that is owned by the state, and the state tailor what exactly should appear. And everyone understood that TV means that this is what the state would like us to know. So by that time in 1996, everyone would watch TV stations in order to know what the state is talking about, not what journalists are.
But this is what's so curious, because essentially you were funded by the state.
Correct. Yeah.
So why didn't you behave properly?
We did not. Unfortunately, I don't know what happened to these guys at that time, But, actually the state, what was interesting, and this is a story for history now, that BBC, they had a channel called BBC Arabic in 1995. And it was something exceptional in the landscape of media in the Arab world. Then they had...
funded by the Saudis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It had problem at that time with the Saudis, and then the channel was closed down. The Emir of Qatar, who has just arrived in power, and at that time, he thought that something like this would be very useful and great for the Arab world. He contacted the guys.
In fact, he liked what the Saudis didn't like.
Exactly. This is one of the blessings in the Arab world. When rulers, we have 22 of them, and so therefore, there is a diversity of opinion, and sometimes within this diversity, you find great opportunities. So what happened is he invited them, and the guys decided to join, because most of them were out of job by that time, and 75 editors of BBC Arabic actually came together to Doha with their equipments. And if you visit now Al Jazeera old studio, you will still see cameras with the logo of the BBC on it.
What was the secret must in the end have been the new ruler of Qatar, that in some way he was different from his father, who he overthrew, and from the Saudis with whom he disagreed.
Correct.
Was he Western educated? What was the...
He is Western educated, but at the same time, he had an idea. Qatar eventually is a small state, basically, in order to...
With a lot of gas.
With a lot of gas. So what will happen in this case, you are a small country with, 250,000 population, but at the same time you have two big neighbors on both sides, Saudi Arabia and Iran. So in order for you to survive, this is my interpretation of what's going on and what's happening, in order to survive, you need to have a network, safety network. Soft power, plus safety network, open relationships with a lot of people. You need proactive policy, rather than just sitting far from events. And I think he succeeded in putting Qatar on the map. Through Al Jazeera, that was one of the major issues, but also through very proactive policy, which we saw even during the Arab Spring.
Well, I mean, that obviously makes a lot of sense, but nevertheless, he was also making a lot of enemies.
In fact, you know, the Arab
Or
world,
you were making a lot of enemies
we
for
have
him.
made a lot of enemies for him, yes.
Yeah.
And a lot of people closed down their embassies. A lot of people, you know, cut ties with Qatar. The last, by the way, to do so was Tunisia. In 2009, if you remember, in November 2009, the Tunisians closed down their embassy in Qatar in protest for our coverage of the presidential elections. We hosted by that time Munsif al-Marzouqi, who was an opposition to Zayn al-Abidin al-Ali, and Munsif al-Marzouqi hosted me last week for dinner in his palace. He's becoming president now in Tunisia, you know. And actually, it would have been impossible for me or for him to imagine that we will be able to go to that place, you know. So becoming, he's the president now of Tunisia. So basically, Zayn al-Abidin al-Ali, he took an action of closing down the embassy and, you know, accusing Qatar of conspiring against Tunisia and accusing Al Jazeera, of course, of fabricating stories and so on. And that was the last government, actually, to close down an embassy. Before that, we had many.
But at the same time as alienating some of the key rulers in the region, the people were flocking to the screens to watch you.
Correct.
Were you aware, as you presided over the management of this TV station, that you were playing a very dangerous game? Or perhaps you just thought you were doing a job?
No. You know,
are you a revolutionary?
By that time, I would have known that it is very risky. It's a matter of life and death. By that time, I have seen an office in Baghdad bombed.
Yeah.
I have seen an office in Kabul bombed. By that time, we have a colleague of ours in Guantanamo, another one in court in Spain, you know, which, by the way, yesterday he was proven, or he won a case against Spain by the European Court of for Justice and Human Rights. So the issue is, definitely it was very clear. And in 2005, I sat here speaking about Tony Blair talking to George Bush, or George Bush talking to Tony Blair about bombing Al Jazeera headquarters in Doha. So definitely we knew how serious and how dangerous the situation was.
But you didn't know that you were actually going to foment an Arab Spring.
We don't know at all. What we are doing at that time, maybe we have adhered to certain values. In 2004, we sat, when I arrived in Al Jazeera, we sat together and said to the guys, listen, what are we exactly doing? Let us define our vision and our mission. And we did not bring consultants to do so. We did it ourselves. I was in Afghanistan, so we have this culture of loya jirga, you know. So we established a tent in the yard of Al Jazeera, and we called it the loya jirga. So every week in that loya jirga, we will meet with all journalists and whoever would like to join, including staff members and so on, and talk about what exactly Al Jazeera is all about. How could we develop ourselves in a clear terminology? How can we define? So we defined ourselves in a clear terminology. It took us about 6 months to do that exercise with 3 lines. Basically, we defined ourselves as a news service that are attempting to spread democracy and human rights in the Arab world by concentrating on
spread them or spread an understanding of them?
Spread the understanding of democracy and the human rights through.
There's a big distinction.
Yeah, exactly, I know.
One,
spreading democracy means we can also bring weapons in order to spread them. No. Spreading the atmosphere that respect democracy and the human rights, plus the concept of the opinion of the other opinion within the framework of professionalism and institutional integrity, whatever. I mean, the Arabic terminology, of course. So since then it was, and before that actually, it was clear that Al Jazeera is in fact advocating certain kind of values. These values are not centered around political party or ideology, but they are centered around what the Arab world needed more.
Yeah.
Now, that is one. Second, our definition of how to deal with the Arab world was very interesting as well, because we thought you need to keep your eye on the or you need to keep your hand on the pulse of the nation. What exactly people feel. So that, in my opinion, led to much more, intimate relationship between Al Jazeera and the public. So when some TV stations would like to propagate or would like to report a story, for example, but because they are funded by a state, they would like to frame it within the parameters of this state understanding. Al Jazeera was not. We would love to see what the masses actually, what the people feel about it. And for example, give you one example. The coverage of the Arab leadership summits, the summits, the annual Arab summit, which is the Arab League summit.
When you see all these old guys sitting around a big table.
Around and talking, and then Gaddafi come deliver a comedy speech and people laughing. That is basically, and actually,
and how did the masses
feel
about that event?
The only speech that we used to cover from A to Z was Gaddafi's speech.
Gaddafi.
Yeah.
Why? Because it was such fun.
Very entertaining. Yeah. so everyone traditionally will carry the speeches, His Highness, His Excellency, His Majesty, everyone. Al Jazeera will send in the morning all over the Arab world SNGs and then ask people what do they think about what's happening in Cairo or what's happening in Riyadh or wherever where the Arab summit is taking place, and transmitting the whole day what people think and what people demand from their leaders. So that was always our approach. We will carry some sections of the speeches, of course. We will split the screen, so we'll have the speech and also we'll have the public somewhere watching and demanding certain kind of demands.
Were you ever conscious that your funder was becoming uncomfortable?
Did
he ever ring you up and say,
yeah,
Wadah, listen, I love it, but could you go steady on my friend down there in the Emir of Kuwait? He's a friend, we would eaten together.
Yeah. Sometimes, actually, yes, the atmosphere will come tense. Why? Because, as you said, Qatar eventually is part of the fabric of the region.
Yeah.
And I remember when we did broadcast the documentary, The Torture, about the Bahrain, in English, Al Jazeera English, I think that morning about 6 or 7 articles were written in the local press in Qatar against Al Jazeera, and in a very clear manner. It was very, because again, people also feel that you should not do this because you are endangering our relationship with the neighboring country.
Was that because you'd reflected some Shia views?
Could
from
be.
Bahrain?
Unfortunately, this sectarian division is becoming very deep.
Yeah. I want to come to that in a moment, but I just want to reach the. We will talk about the Arab Spring, and we'll talk too about the Shia-Sunni hot war, as I would describe it now, which is very dangerous. But I wanted to find out how it was that after this huge success of capturing this vast audience and playing this extremely prominent part, you came to lose your job.
Because of the great success. I thought that's enough. 8 years. The Arab Spring itself created.
You went
also
voluntarily, or he rang you up and said?
I went voluntarily.
Wadah, listen, you've been a huge success. I can give you a very nice pension.
No, actually, it was my decision. I thought that for a while now, not actually now, that 8 years is the number of years that I could really survive by always being, proactive and creative as far as the management of Al Jazeera is concerned, and that's enough. And also there is another reason, which the Arab world is living in a new mood, and I feel that I could do something as well, which Al Jazeera cannot allow me to do, which is becoming part of this dynamics within the region, and therefore
you wanted to play a more political role yourself.
A role, might be political.
A more political
yes,
role.
More political role. Correct. I would like to speak my opinion. I would like to play a more political role. I would like to get involved in this transformation that's taking place in the Arab world. That will be impossible to do it through Al Jazeera.
You said that Qatar itself has played an interesting role in the Arab, and so it has. It was very active in Libya. Is it active in Syria?
Not as active as it was active in Libya.
Yeah, but
Syria is different dynamics.
That's half an answer. Is it active in Syria?
Actually, there is some kind of activism in Syria, but within the Arab League and the Council, the Gulf Council.
But you don't think that they are perhaps
there is
supplying the rebels?
No.
Not at all?
I don't think so.
Morally?
No one is supporting
Morally?
them. In my opinion, analytically, I have no information, no one is supporting the rebels.
Not even the Saudis?
Not even the Saudis.
Because they would dearly like to see the end of the Assad regime.
But in a way that they could manage. You know, I think Syria is very complicated. Not easy that people could just bring the regime without understanding or without preparing what alternative they are going to see. Syria is not like any other country. It is the cornerstone of a bloc in the region, and therefore a lot of countries are worried about what is going to happen next day when Bashar is out of power. So this is why, in my opinion, the Arab world is reluctant about Syria. They were not reluctant about Libya. The Arab League took very proactive decision regarding Libya, and they called upon international.
Libya doesn't really matter, does it? Let's face it.
This is what I'm saying. The strategic way.
No, I mean, I wouldn't go on the record as that. I mean, I wouldn't broadcast that, but it has been broadcast. But I mean, but I mean, strategically, Libya is a strange island out there in the Maghreb. It's not strategic to the region, is it?
Syria is
it was strategic in the sense that,
that,
of course, Gaddafi had money to splash about, but he splashed most of it into Africa anyway.
Yeah.
But Syria, that is strategic.
Much more strategic.
And what is interesting is that, as a reporter, I hardly noticed that the Alawis were Shia. I mean, you know, the Ba'athist outfit is a remorselessly secular setup. And yet, suddenly it's becoming reported as a Shia setup. And of course, there are a lot of people who want to get rid of Shias. There used to be a lot of people who used to want to get rid of Baathists, but now it's Shias. It's shifted.
I was the bureau chief of Baghdad. I had more than 100 employees in my office. I've never known who was Shia and who was Sunnah.
No, but then nobody did anyway.
Exactly. I mean, when His Royal Highness Mr. Paul Bremer decided to come up with this genius idea of governing council based on sectarian lines, everyone started rediscovering his identity. Then the Iranian interference in Iraq and the fact that they were pushing to support certain factions, that created also another polarization. Then the polarization now is deepened after the issue of Syria. So Syria is eventually, if you remember 2006, people supported Hezbollah, Sunnis,
but I mean,
in his war against
the Bremers of this world hardly understood that there were Shias and Sunnis. I mean, even Blair and Bush were a bit hazy about quite how all that worked.
I think, you know, there was no proper understanding of history. They didn't know anything about history.
But now it seems possibly that even the Arab world itself is prepared to compartmentalize people along those lines. And it sounds to me as if the Assad regime is now being assaulted as a Shia entity.
Not at all.
No?
No. Everyone knew that Assad regime is Alawite for the last few decades. And the Arab world was working together with Syria. Qatar, you mentioned Qatar. Qatar has had very strong relationship with Syria. Maybe the closest countries to each other in the Arab world were Qatar and Syria. So
what went wrong?
What went wrong actually is Bashar could not understand that he should start serious reforms to meet people halfway. First of all, the regime
in charge.
The regime is very oppressive for decades. Huge oppression took place in Syria in the 80s, and it's a very close regime.
The father killed 40,000.
The father. However, the idea that he is supportive of resistance against the Israelis, supporting Hezbollah and Hamas, gave some kind of credibility to the regime, domestically and regionally, by saying, listen, these guys at least are supporting, you know, resistance. But now the Arab Spring brought an end to this kind of discussion. The issue is, are you going to continue dictatorship and authoritarian regime, or going to meet people halfway, or going to make proper reforms?
That's fascinating, because it meant that really the struggle was no longer strategic about Arab Israel, it was now about domestic rights of the people.
That doesn't mean that the Arabs who have revolted against their governments are actually going to favor Israel, for example.
I'm not suggesting that.
But what's happening?
Suddenly they were focusing on their own rights.
For 5 decades, the issue of Palestine was used by Arab regimes to suppress their people.
Yeah.
The law of emergency, for example, in Egypt, started initially because of Israel, but eventually ended to monopolize power and to put opposition in jail. So people thought, listen, okay, Israel is one issue. Let us first finish with this issue domestically, and after that we can speak about Israel. In my opinion, what's happening right now, yes, even in the Tahrir Square, if you remember, 18 days we didn't hear a lot of slogans against Israel.
Never. I was there in the square looking for it and never saw it. Never even saw any slogans against the US.
Correct. Only one night. Only one night. When the representatives of Obama went there and they said it is necessary that Hosni Mubarak should remain in power for the stability of Egypt. I heard them screaming that night for a few minutes. Then the spokesperson of the State Department appeared and he said, sorry, this man represents himself only.
So Syria, the trouble surely is that nobody knows what would replace the Ba'athist regime, because the rebels are very, very disparate. They're very divided.
If the regime is, if the revolution in Syria succeeds in getting rid of the regime without sectarian war or without military confrontation within the society itself between the Sunnis and the Alawites, I think it is not difficult to find a solution or to find a government that could succeed based on other experiences that we have in Tunisia and in Libya. But if we are going to see sectarian fight, then the output is going to be very complicated, and then we are in front of very complicated scenario in the future. My opinion, the regime favors sectarian confrontation in the country as a last resort to extend the presence of the regime and to maneuver in order to find a way out of it.
Are you depressed about Egypt?
Not at all. No. I'm very happy and very optimistic, by the way, and everything is perfect about Egypt. Nothing wrong.
Come on. I mean, the army hasn't given an inch.
Exactly, but this is a dynamic.
Oh, you're happy about that?
No, of course not. I'm not happy about the army not giving. But what my theory is, that the route that we are following in the region is towards the right direction. You know, from now until then, we are going to go through a lot of troubles. But this is maturing the society. And this is examining to what extent we are developing thoughts and ideas about democracy. This kind of dynamics is happening between the army and the youth and Muslim Brotherhood and other parties is fantastic. For the first time, we have the pleasure of disagreeing with each other and talking to each other and agreeing and making coalition and fighting each other and so on and so forth.
I accept that, but it's very strange. That's the politics, that's the economics. These guys have a stranglehold over the Egyptian economy. I mean, they own hotels, boats, tour vessels, means of production, trucking companies. They're not going to give those up easily.
There are 3 basic demands, in my opinion, the army is interested to maintain. The first one, the army demands some kind of immunity against any future persecution. The second, economy, as you said, maybe 25 to 30% of some estimations of the economy is in fact managed by the army. The third issue is influence over certain kind of sectors of the society. For example, you know, the governance of all provinces almost are generals. So that is one thing that they would like to continue in the future, you know. So they have some demands. Now they are putting certain kind of conditions by saying, okay, we would love to give, but the constitution should guarantee for the army a status above the ordinary partisan politics. And they are giving the model of Turkey, the old Turkish constitution, whereby the army had also some equal position to the president, actually.
And where the president has just sacked 53 generals in the last 6 months.
This is exactly what's happening at this moment in time. Turkey itself gave up the system, and the system is not working because it cannot. So the opposition refused this kind of proposal. It will continue. The negotiations will continue, either on the table or in the street, until the army will be convinced to give up for an elected president in June.
What's going to happen in Bahrain, the most underreported crisis.
The problem of Bahrain is, in fact, complicated. You know, this
By
is
the Americans?
No, not the Americans.
By the Saudis?
The major and the most important problem that has happened in Bahrain, that the society itself split into two sections, the Sunnis and the Shia.
And institutionally.
Institutionally. That is a major problem. In a way, when we saw the Tunisian revolution, we saw people across the spectrum protesting against the regime. We saw the same in Egypt, Muslims, Christians, you know, rural and modern, everyone. But now in Bahrain, we have a split of the society. So the political elite, which is Sunni, was supported by the Sunni population. And the Shia were opposition. That almost was actually the line of definition of what's happening. So this split prevented the Bahraini uprising from becoming a revolution or a regime change. And that actually led to some kind of stagnant situation that we see right now in Bahrain.
Now we come to the $64,000 issue, Saudi Arabia. You know, Cameron has just been there. I blogged at the weekend that this was the most discreet and shy visit that any Western leader has made to Saudi Arabia in recent times. He took no press with him. He lasted about 4 hours on the ground, and the Downing Street statement ran to 100 words and was published at 7:44 on Saturday evening, when there is hardly a decent hack alive in Fleet Street. It was a very, very quiet business. And that we have 62 billion pounds of trade with Saudi Arabia. And so we're very happy to have that relationship. But it means, of course, that we don't want anything to happen there. Is anything happening there?
The Arab Spring is not going to spare anyone. You know, certain...
That's probably the most important statement tonight. The Arab Spring is not going to spare anyone.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So what will happen in the future now? You are going to see people resisting change. I read, now today I was reading actually statements for some people, prominent people in the Gulf, saying that, you know, America and Muslim Brotherhood are conspiring against the stability of the region and so on. So the issue is, if they understand the Arab Spring as a conspiracy, there's a major mistake. That will lead to a lot of problems within any country that does not accept proper reform and serious constitutional reform. Monarchies so far are more stable until now. But Morocco had a lot of troubles, and now they reached some kind of solution with the opposition. They met them halfway, and they made...
And he's a slightly more elastic operator than...
They did. I mean, he succeeded now of making constitutional reform and running fair and free elections where the new government is led by Islamists and in coalition with other parties as well. So that, for now, in my opinion, Morocco have succeeded of understanding the moment and dealing with it. Jordan still has to do that. I mean, still, I think there should be some kind of serious constitutional reform in Jordan and proper management of the, and we have strong opposition taking place right now in Jordan. Then you go to the Gulf. Now, in the Gulf, there is more complexity than Morocco and Jordan. One of them is Iran. There is a feeling amongst a lot of people that Iran is a threat, sometimes exaggerated a threat, against the Gulf. And therefore, okay, would you like to change the reality in the Gulf, so therefore you weaken your regimes and systems, and then you are going to see the Iranians coming across and taking over?
Well, it's very difficult when you have the Americans entering a country and inviting them in.
The Americans now, as you know, are leaving. There is a feeling within the political elite and with everyone in the region that the Americans are withdrawing. After they withdrew from Iraq, and now they're talking about withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the mood in general that the Americans are leaving. So if the Americans are leaving, so to whom are they going to leave the protection of the status quo in the region? So that is a major worry in the region, in my opinion. So that is complicating the situation. Why I'm saying Syria is very important? Syria is important because if the Syrian revolution succeeds, in my opinion, the Iranians are going to face troubles within the country itself. Because, you know, Iran is building this kind of alliance in the region. Iran, Iraq, Syria, up to Beirut. This is some kind of, crescent of influence of the Iranians. If Syria is out of it, then you are talking about decline of Iranian influence in the region. The decline of the Iranian influence means that they may not become as, dangerous between two brackets against the Gulf as they are right now. So this will give more confidence and more relaxed environment for serious changes to take place in the region.
But you're discussing a country in Iran that has not invaded another country in more than 300 years.
Correct. Yeah.
Why should it start now?
You see, the issue is not only about invasion. The fact that the Iranians right now are the people who run Iraq, basically.
Yeah. Not their fault. I mean, if there hadn't been an American
not their
invasion,
fault, exactly.
they'd have stayed where they are.
But if you are living in the Gulf, whereby Iraq, you are accustomed to Iraq as the protector of the Arab presence in the Gulf, and for decades now, Iraq is the barrier between the Arab countries and Iran. Now, Iraq is not only the barrier; Iraq has become part of the Iranian influence in the region. So there is a scary influence over other Arab countries, especially in the Gulf. Besides the fact that Iranians also act through proxies and act through groups and act through a lot of interest groups. So they don't have to interfere physically, but they do a lot of proactive work within certain circles.
But a lot of those group and country alliances are about causing trouble for the Americans and the Israelis. I mean, if you take Hezbollah and Hamas and the rest of it, in the end, if you look at the beginnings, the Americans, the Iranians became interested in those groups because the Americans hated them so much. And if they could cause the Americans a lot of trouble and the Israelis a lot of trouble, that was in a sense one up for them.
Now you need to differentiate between Hezbollah and Hamas in this particular incident, because Hezbollah and Hamas, Hezbollah of course has announced officially open support to Syria. And they accused what's happening, they claim that what's happening in Syria is a conspiracy, foreign conspiracy against the country that has supported the resistance. Hamas did not. Hamas kept silent. And they took a middle ground by saying that they are supporting the people. However, they acknowledge that the regime, supported resistance one day. In my opinion, if the crisis continue, then Hamas will be out of Syria completely. They cannot continue being in Syria. And I think they have taken most of their families out of Syria anyway right now. So that is going also, the definition is going to become much more on sectarian line or Shia Sunnah line than anything else. This is unfortunate, of course. Now, to what extent American pressure at this moment in time against Iran is going to be helpful? If I was Iranian or were Iranian, I would say that American pressure is helpful for me, because the more Iran is under threat from the Israelis and the Americans, the more they can bring together the society, and the more they can resist any kind of fragmentation within the society, especially after the split within the conservative camp within Iran itself.
Just before we leave Saudi Arabia, the only real trouble that we're aware of is in eastern Saudi Arabia amongst the Shia, the oil workers and the rest of it, which has been fairly brutally put down. The Saudis are also actively inside Bahrain still. But is that the limit of it? Is that the limit of Saudi Arabia's involvement and its trouble?
In my opinion, anything in the region will happen later on, not now.
Later.
We have some time. We have to watch what's going to happen in Syria, what's going to happen in Iraq, what's going to happen in Iran.
And what happens if the king dies of old age in the course of it?
His brother will replace him.
And what happens if he dies of old age?
His son will replace him, or someone from his...
Well, the next one down is an unknown, the 57-year-old, I forget his name, but he is thought to be a hardliner.
No, the prince now, who is the crown prince, is Prince Naif, who is the Minister of Interior.
Yeah, he's
now,
an old chap.
He has been declared as the crown prince.
Right.
So the line of succession at this moment in time is in a way clear. So the king, then his brother. Now what will happen after him, theoretically there's supposed to be a council of succession that consists of the second generation, the young princes who sit together and choose or elect one of them. This is what has been decreed officially by the state. But the issue, in my opinion, is not going to be the succession. It's going to be what's going to happen in the region itself altogether, and what kind of impact that will have on the Saudi citizens and the Saudi population, what kind of imagination the youth are going to have for the future, and to what extent the state can understand the ambitions of the youth and deal with it, directly.
We've taken some very interesting routes through a lot of different countries, and I hope we've been able to sort of remain on deck together. I don't know whether anybody would like now to... I have lots more questions, but I think we should throw it open to the floor, because there are a lot of very informed people here who I know would like to cross-examine Wadah. Let's have a question at the back there with the specs.
Yeah. Sorry, Chris Swanglers. I'm a retired sound recorder that worked a long time in current affairs and documentaries. I'm very intrigued to ask you my first question. I'll have others later. What influence the Wahhabist Islamic perception has on the Sunni community and the resultant divisions with the Shia?
Definitely, the Wahhabi understanding of Islam is much more, radical on understanding the Shia phenomena than the political Islam or the other Islamic movements. So you will find that the discourse and the rhetoric itself is very harsh. Now the point is, they may be harsh, and that is true, but the impact of this kind of rhetoric on the ground is not as strong as the political failure of Iran and the political failure of the Arabs also in their relationship with Iran. So the crisis now is not because of the Wahhabis. The Wahhabis have been critical of the Shia for a long time, not now. And a lot of also Shia factions are very critical of the Sunnis for a long time. The issue, in my opinion, what led to this crisis is the Iranian interference in Iraq and this whole dynamics around it. The Sunnis discovered that they felt that what the Iranians are doing against supporting certain factions against the Sunnis is the source of all their troubles. Remember, in 2006, as I said, the Sunni world stood behind Hezbollah in the war in southern Lebanon. So it is not an issue of Sunni Shia. But later on, when Saddam Hussein was executed, that is the day, in my opinion, that marks the beginning of a huge clash psychologically between the Shia and the Sunnah.
I mean, you haven't mentioned Pakistan, but the Wahhabi influence in Pakistan has been quite definite, detectable, and damaging. And I wanted to mention that I had a conversation 2 years ago with Jalili, the nuclear negotiator for Iran, Saeed Jalili. And he said, you people think that we're frightened of Israel and America when it comes to nuclear weapons. We're worried about Pakistan. We're worried about what happens when Wahhabi-educated radicals get hold of those weapons. The first target will be Tehran.
I doubt that, really. The Pakistani society is a mosaic of a lot of groups and cults and organizations and movements. Some of the prominent prime ministers of Pakistan were Shia, and still some of the leading figures of the Pakistani politics are from various religious groups. Of course, in Pakistan, you have a lot of chaos. This is not, in my opinion, a Shia-Sunni matter. It is the matter of a state going, in a direction of chaos since the invasion of Afghanistan. So there are Sunnis killing Sunnis, there are Shia killing Sunnis, there are tribal people killing army, and so on. So it is not...
Two extraordinary, interesting observations. I mean, the chaos in Iraq and between Sunni Shia is largely, you're saying, because of the Western invasion of Iran, and you're saying the chaos in Pakistan
Absolutely.
Is largely the invasion
Absolutely.
by Western forces of Afghanistan.
Correct, yeah. That is a major problem. I think people who interfere in the region, they do not understand history properly. They have not read about it. They don't understand that if you tamper with the balance within the society, you may really create huge tension. I think Shia and Sunnah in Iraq, for the last few decades before the invasion, they were living together. You will have Shia and you will have Sunnah in government. Actually, some of the senior aides to Saddam Hussein are Shia. Until now, they did not go out of jail. Until now, they are still defending Saddam. It means that the institution, the Ba'ath institution itself, it was neither Sunni nor Shia.
You know that 4 very impressive academics who had studied the region very carefully were called in by Blair before the war to brief him and to advise him as to whether he was going to make the right decision in the invasion. All 4 of them told him exactly what you said. These are very delicate lattice works of relationships. You upset them at your peril. And he said, but you do agree, he is a very bad man. So, yes, there.
Yes, thank you very much for some absolutely astonishing comments. My name's Ewan Grant. I'm a former intelligence analyst with UK Customs and Excise, and we used a lot and still do the work of Tom Clancy as case studies, and I have to wonder if you are actually a senior advisor to him, because you have given scenarios which are exactly his plots, and I think you got there first. My question follows on from Mr. Snow's bringing in Pakistan to the equation. Are there any signs of the scenario you then talked about, that on the western side of the Gulf, nations and elites are turning increasingly to Pakistan as an insurance policy against Iran? Thank you.
No. I mean, I did not fear really that the people in the Gulf are really turning to Pakistan. Pakistan has a lot of troubles in the image of the people there. Pakistan is also going through serious crisis and is not qualified to become the protector of the so-called Sunni presence in the region.
Not even the armed forces?
Not even the armed forces. But there is another country that people increasingly are viewing as more active in that regard, which is Turkey. So Turkey is rising in the region as the powerful, prosperous Sunni state that is balancing the Iranian influence. And you heard maybe the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Turkey a few days ago warning against Cold War in the region. And the Cold War in the region in this case would be between Iran and Turkey. So Iran and Turkey do not meet on many issues. One of them is Iraq, and the other one is Syria. And if you remember a few weeks ago, the Iranians officially warned that, or one of the senior officials warned that if Turkey is going to support the rebels against Bashar al-Assad, then Iran is not going to keep silent. Of course, the tension also became much more prominent when the Turks decided to spread the defense, the shield, the missile shield, the NATO missile system in the Turkish territories, where Iran viewed that as a hostile act. So there is a tension taking place at this moment in time between the Iranians and the Turks, and the Arabs, the masses maybe in the Arab world, feel that Turkey is closer to them than any other regional country. While the Arab elite, political, at least governments, most of them don't see Turkey as a great protector. Why? Because also they accuse Turkey, or they view Turkey as a role model for political Islam. And this is going to be dangerous for them in the region. So you will find people admiring Turkey, but you will find governments skeptical about Turkey, or some governments at least.
Yes. There's a microphone coming.
Yes, I'm Martin Short. I'm a journalist. You come from Jenin. The core issue remains Israel-Palestine. You have expressed a desire to be involved politically, or be free to talk about political matters. Do you see yourself having any role in that particular matter, that particular arena? And what is your view of where we stand now in the conflict?
We have deep crisis in the Palestinian side, deep leadership crisis. So first you have the split between Hamas and Fatah, which is very severe and ruined the Palestinian national unity. And you have at the same time also lack of imagination of how the Palestinians should handle their affairs. With the lack of balance in the region, strategic balance, especially after the two states that were defining the balance in the region, Egypt as the leader of the so-called moderate bloc and Syria as the so-called resistance bloc, I think no one in Palestine or Palestinian leadership at this moment in time can define exactly what next step should be until they see what's going to happen in Egypt and in Syria. So meanwhile, they started meeting together, Hamas and Fatah. Now, are they meeting for serious kind of agreement? I doubt it. But I think each one of them has his own reasons where he should sit around the table. Hamas has reasons because, again, as I said, the whole balance of power is changing, and the bloc that was led by Syria is now crumbling. And Fatah has a reason because Egypt has changed already, and the arrival of Muslim Brotherhood into the scene is not going to be very helpful as far as they can see it. So they have to sit with Hamas and to find some common ground. But the negotiations between Fatah and Hamas, most of it is now technical. I mean, we have not, because the major difference is political. Now, as much as I know, I don't think that they are not really negotiating or talking about unified vision regarding the future of Palestine. So that is going to be a problem. Now, we have major problem in the region. Lack of imagination. Everyone is talking about two-state solution, and that has become like, a sacred quotation that everyone must repeat at the beginning of any statement related to Palestine and Israel. Now, when you sit with most of these actors and talk to them, they tell you the two-state solution is not working. Now, what is the solution or what is the alternative? They don't know. So because they don't know what is the alternative, we stick to the two-state solution and we repeat ourselves. And then the process becomes a target on its own, not the result. The process is negotiations. Let us negotiate for the sake of negotiations. Something that we did in Al Jazeera in the end of 2010 was the release of the Palestinian documents, the minutes of negotiations between the Palestinians and Israelis for 10 years. We published that in coordination with The Guardian. Now, if you read the documents, all of them are on the internet, thousands of pages, you can understand to what extent this process is actually not working. It is unbelievable. The people are repeating themselves. There is no conclusion, and they are admitting in the negotiations that they are doing so for the sake of just keeping themselves relevant as far as their people is concerned and the international society. So definitely there is a lack of imagination, and the Palestinians and the Israelis should think of a solution outside this closed box that they put themselves in for the last few decades. I'm not intending actually to be part of that, because already I've launched my initiative in Tunisia a few days ago, which is going to concentrate on transition in the Arab world, supporting the youth and establishing partnership with political groups and movements and business people to guarantee stability in the democratic life.
Before I call on my friend in the corner, what other questions around? Any other hands around? I want to see some women. No. Oh, good. First class. Right. So you go next, and then we'll.
Last night, Luke D'Agostino, a freelancer. Last night here. Sorry. Okay. Freelancer, Luke D'Agostino. Last night here, we were discussing the Egyptian revolution, and a new expression came to my mind, but maybe everyone's familiar with it, called the deep state. Is there any way that you can describe that clearly to me? I can only guess at it. My second final question is, which state do you think is deepest?
This concept actually emerged from Turkey initially. I mean, everyone was talking about the deep state in Turkey that was trying to put obstacles in front of the AK party in transition during the last 8 years. And then they uncovered what is now known in the Turkish press, the Ergenekon case, where generals, journalists, business people and intelligence officers combined together in a group that was trying to do some kind of sometimes coups and sometimes even violence and explosions in order to stop the progress towards democracy and transformation. In Egypt, the bureaucracy of Egypt itself is deeply rooted. Circles of interest. During the last few years, you should remember something important in the last 10 years, since 11 September, again, the American interference in the region. You know, the beginning of George Bush, if you remember, he stood up and he said, we need democracy in the Arab world. Everyone started doing some kind of democracy. You know, a little bit of elections, whatever, and human rights organizations start spreading because George Bush said that. When 11 September took place, George Bush and his administration actually started coordinating with the Arab intelligence agencies and Arab governments rendition, torture, and intelligence communication. That unleashed the Arab regimes, and they started using the war on terrorism as an excuse to put everyone in jail, including their opposition. During the last 10 years, Arab governments lost contact with reality at all, because they have been given a green light to do whatever they want to do. With the presence of CIA officers in cells in Morocco, or torture cells in Cairo, or in Jordan, wherever, or Damascus, you know. So they have been acknowledged, and they have been even admired for the acts that they are committing against their people. So governments, because they would like to maximize power, so they unleashed an appetite which could not stop. So they cancelled everything, including their political parties. So the political party in Egypt, which is the ruling party, did not really have any influence over the regime, because the regime itself started to be Hosni Mubarak, his children, his wife, and some of the circles around them. Most of them are very rich business people. The same in Tunisia. The party itself has no rule in the country. Only the small family has rule, or has say over everything, with interests group, business people. So this marriage between business and smaller groups of individuals ruling the country created what you could say now the deep state. These people are still there. A lot of them are still there. So they don't like to see this transformation taking place easily until they guarantee also their share of the future. So here there is a threat. Beside the bureaucracy itself, which might, and I'm coming from Tunisia now, reports about economy, I think that there is a little bit of, not a little, a lot of exaggeration on the status of economy, scaring the public, you know. The chief of the governor of the central bank is saying that maybe in 2 months or whatever, we may not be able to fulfill the duties of the state. This is a very scary thing to say at this moment in time. So this environment might become also a source of worry in these countries.
And which is the deepest state, he asked.
I think Egypt has inherited the longest and the most complicated bureaucracy and influence, centers of influence in the Arab world. For decades now, for generations. The Egyptian state itself is well established, and it has its own, you know, long surviving bureaucracy.
Yeah, let's have your point, please.
My name is Magda Walter. I'm a former journalist and media consultant. I want to follow up, really, and ask you if you could possibly expand on your answer to the question asked by the gentleman next to me, who sort of preempted what I wanted to ask about, and go back to the Arab-Israeli conflict. You said that there is a lack of imagination on the Palestinian side in terms of solutions.
And the Israeli side.
And the Israeli side, and that the negotiations have been sort of going around in circles, if you will, for decades. Would the changes that are happening in the Arab world right now, the dynamics of the changes that haven't ended, not just the Arab Spring, but everything else, be a game-changing situation, because there is no longer this sort of Arab solidarity monolith, and therefore some of those imaginative solutions, which were absent until now, because there was this sort of Israeli bogeyman that the governments, the Arab governments used to control their street with, that that is gone now, and therefore these creative solutions would emerge, and there might finally be a possible movement in advancing the Arab-Israeli conflict or solution, if you will.
The Israelis should be very careful from now on not to provoke the street in the Arab world. Because before, as you said, governments will be able to control the movement of the street. So whenever, you remember the war in Gaza, for example, the Egyptians couldn't march in the streets, but in a few just very limited places, in solidarity with the Palestinians. And in my opinion, that also created a lot of anger and the frustration within the Egyptian society. Now, when the Israelis a few months ago shot some soldiers across the borders, it was the people, not the government, that arranged a huge demonstration in Tahrir, and they invaded the Israeli embassy in Cairo. So now there is a new dynamics. You cannot stop the public from expressing their frustration if anything happens. What I'm sure about, I don't think new governments in the region are going to provoke the Israelis or confront with the Israelis at this moment in time. I think the priorities are much more clear in their mind. However, the public, if they are provoked or they feel humiliated, they might react stronger than what the Israelis used to see during Hosni Mubarak and Zayn al-Abidin and the rest of the guys. So this is the imagination that I'm talking about is related to the fact that if the Israelis are going to stay part of the region and they would like to live as part of the region, and that is the future, so they should behave as well as part of the region. And for a while now, we, as I always say, I have been covering the story of living in South Africa when Mr. Nelson Mandela in 1994 became the president of the country. And I've seen to what extent Nelson Mandela was capable of bringing people together and forming a society which has, until now, survived in a prosperous manner. I remember at that time, people are talking about separation as well, and Bantustans and so on and so forth. But that is gone. We have been negotiating divorce, and they in South Africa negotiated marriage. They succeeded and we have failed. So maybe we have to explore other initiatives and other ways of thinking in order to feel some kind of a new imagination.
Yes, let's have a question here, please.
Hi, Deep Harvaz, Al Jazeera. Do you think that the Gulf states are destined to only play a proxy role in Iran's standoff with the West, or do you think they'll ever play an active role in a solution?
They have genuine interest, not only proxy one. I mean, they have genuine interest in finding a way for Iran not to interfere. You see the issue now, for example, today, I have read a lot of statements coming from the Gulf saying that the discourse the Americans are spreading about Iran is going to be harmful. Any attack against Iran is not going to be helpful to the region, which I think they are serious about it, because they cannot manage the ramifications of a huge attack against Iran. But at the same time, they would like to see Iran that is confined to the borders of the country, does not have huge influence within their territories through any group that they have. So that is what the Gulf. So on one hand, they are not excited about the war with Iran, but on the other hand, they don't want Iran to continue having this great influence in the region.
In the middle here, or yeah, no, I'll follow you. Don't worry.
Richard Gisbert, I'm with Al Jazeera. How seriously do you see the conflict, or the escalation, the rhetorical escalation between the Israelis and the Turks? I know that there are people in both countries who say that a military conflict between the two states is not entirely out of the question. The reason I ask is because that's such a tasty scenario, given that Turkey being a NATO ally, the Americans would be treaty-bound to come to the Turks' defense.
I definitely don't see any possibility of a military clash between Turkey and Israel. The crisis has reached the peak, because of the flotilla and all the issues. But I think the Israelis will not be interested to escalate with the Turks, and the Turks will not be interested as well to go beyond certain borders. So they have reached that kind of conflict. Now they have to find a way either of keeping the tension as it is. They will not increase. Maybe it will help both parties to keep it. Maybe it's useful sometimes to have a little bit of tension like that. But I don't think they will go beyond this at all.
You know, one of the fascinating things has been the difficulty that outsiders have had with reporting the domestic Israeli revolt, which is, of course, completely economic and nothing to do with Arab Israel. But it doesn't fit the vernacular of rapportage about the region. And so it's been incredibly underreported. And yet, if you think of all these pressures on the Israeli government, the internal, I mean, if you get 365,000 people on the streets of Tel Aviv, largely unreported outside, but that's what it was. If you then have the Turks, you have the Syrian crisis, you have the Egyptian crisis and the rest of it, and you have, you know, the continuing problem with Palestine.
No doubt, yeah.
You know, you'd have thought somebody somewhere would think, maybe we should do some thinking.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Serious.
Very serious, yeah. Yes, questions? Yes, you. Yeah, why not? And there, you got it. You got it. And then this one will be the second one. Thank you. Yeah, go for it. In the middle. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you.
Tell us
how
who
do
you
you
are.
see? I'm Roberta, and I'm a student. And I would like to ask you, how do you see the Arab region in, say, 5 years' time?
The crystal ball, I didn't bring it.
That's a small question for you.
Very small. Maybe 30 is easier, you know, but 5 years.
Give us 30.
Oh, 30.
Yeah. Okay. Let me tell you something. There was a historical mistake in creating 22 states in the Arab world after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, if you now go read some literature, as I'm doing nowadays, there's a magnificent book called Peace to End All Peace. Which
called what?
Peace to End All Peace.
Peace to End All Peace.
The story of the making of the new Middle East, of the Middle East after 1918, after the First World War. You know, most of these countries were not actually, the borders were not defined based on any rational logic, besides certain kind of interest. So Syria, based on the book, will be created in order to become a buffer zone between the British and Turkey. And Syria was given to the French. So a lot of things happened like that. And Churchill said that he made Jordan after lunch. So, you know, so a lot of quick decisions about the borders has created a lot of troubles. Most of these entities that we have at this moment in time, they cannot be called nation states because they lack the concept of the nation. Therefore, they are territorial entities. Most of the demography in the region does not allow this scenario to continue. You know, I'm living in the Gulf, for example. Most of the population of Qatar or Bahrain or Saudi Arabia or Emirates or Kuwait are part of the same tribes, same families. So, but they carry different passports. So the fact that we have countries and nation states is not deeply rooted. The legitimacy of the state in the Arab world does not really exist deeply in the hearts of the people. So what I'm saying, if tomorrow we are going to speak seriously about development and integration, development and prosperity, economic prosperity, we need to speak about integration. No doubt about it. You have a huge amount of wealth in the Gulf, but also you have a huge shortage of manpower. You have a huge manpower in the North Africa and a huge shortage in the wealth. And you have Sudan, which has great resources, agriculture, where everyone needs it. So think of the Arab world as 3 major blocks. The first one is the Arabian Peninsula, that extends from Yemen up to the borders of Turkey, including Iraq and Syria. Then you have the valley of the Nile, where you have Egypt and Sudan. And then you have Al-Maghrib al-Arabi, which is the western part of the Arab world, which is North Africa. That might, in the future, represent much more stable political and economic reality than the current map, which is very fragmented and does not really have a lot of logic behind the formation of the borders.
Thank you very much. Where was you? There you were, yeah.
My name is Rona. I'm not a journalist. My question is, I wanted to know what your opinion is about the Islamic Brotherhood, which you've kind of touched on. How do you see it affecting the Arab Spring? And how do you see the increase in religiousness in the region from 10 years ago, if you visit some Arab countries and then you visit them now, there's a big difference in religiousness. How do you see it affecting the future of the Arab world?
The phenomena is old. The Arab, the political Islam. Now let us qualify the term, because I found that a lot of people might not define clearly what do they mean by political Islam. I mean political Islam, the Islamic movement that emerged in Egypt in 1927 by Hassan al-Banna, which is called now Muslim Brotherhood. Within this paradigm of thinking, tens of movements, started to spread all over the Islamic world. They exist right now in about 72 countries all over the world. Now, Turkey is, in a way or another, a product of the political Islam phenomena. And also, Sudan is a product of Islamic, and Yemen. But the issue which I would like to mention here, political Islam started in 1927 as a reaction to traditional understanding of Islam. And therefore, the first people to be critical of the political Islam were not the West or Western circles. It was actually traditional institutions in the Islamic world. So the people who led the modern movement, which I argue that political Islam is a result of modernity. Those who led these movements were professors, doctors, engineers, graduates from Western universities and graduates from secular institutions, not religious institutions. The religious institutions stood against the rise of politics. And until today, this tension exists between traditional Islamists and the political Islam movement. They have gone through huge, experience, from participation in politics in the 40s, in parliaments, making coups against, whatever, making revolution in Syria in 1982, where 30,000 people were killed, and then participating in parliaments in Egypt and in Jordan and in Yemen, coalition with secularists, coalition with socialists, coalition with regimes like Numeiri regime in Sudan. So, there is very rich experience behind the so-called movement, the Islamic movement of today. These people right now have matured much more than ever when they declared in the 90s that they have adopted officially democracy and the human rights based on international, parameters, to a large extent, of course, not exactly, but they believe that this is the way for change. And they gave up any involvement in any military or any violent act against the state. So they were put in jail in Egypt, but no one responded violently. They were, marginalized in Jordan, for example, but they did not develop any negative or any violent sentiment against the state. Political Islam of today, the Islamists who are Ikhwan Muslimin in Egypt, Al-Nahda Party in Tunisia, Al-Islah movement in Yemen, and Ikhwan in, or whatever party, and AK party in Turkey, these people, in my opinion, are defining their discourse based on pragmatic reality rather than ideology. So they are developing with time, they are becoming, if you like, a conservative party like the Christian Democrats in the West, but not as a religious group that is trying to bring about implementation of certain or strict code of understanding of Islam. The vice versa is happening. I'm coming from Tunisia, and Al-Nahda Party, which has won the elections, have formed the government in coalition with leftists and secularists. And the coalition so far is working. And they gave the presidency to a secular person, and the chief of the, or the spokesperson of the parliament is the head of the leftist group. So this kind of coalition is not ideological by nature, it is pragmatic by nature. So political Islam is moving towards more openness. Given the fact that Turkey is representing a role model, then we are in front of more modernization and more liberal understanding of politics rather than radical one.
We're into our last 5 minutes, and therefore what I suggest is we'll take a round robin of questions from the floor, and we'll try to draw the threads together. So every hand that's up at the moment, we will try to get the... So no more hands that are up now. Yes. So your question, and then if you'd hand it to the lovely lady just in front of you there, and then we're going to give you... Yeah, let's go.
Thank you. Christopher Mitchell, independent producer. I'd like to ask you a slightly unfair question about the future of Al Jazeera, if I may. I think it's fairly fair to say that under your direction, there was a significant kind of journalistic drive to the overall direction of the channel. And I wonder how you see that continuing now under your successor, who is an oil executive and I think also a relation of the ruling family. How confident are you that the independence and the journalistic thrust of Al Jazeera will continue?
Al Jazeera's journalistic flame, is it flickering? Yes?
Hi, Burhan Al-Gailani. I'm a communications consultant. You spoke earlier about the role Nelson Mandela played in South Africa and bringing that country together. Do you see any leaders of similar stature in the Middle East at this time who could help push things forward? Thank you.
Where is Arabi's Mandela? Yes.
Hello, Sarah Ingham. I'm just wondering whether you see a changed role for women in the region in the future. Thank you.
And at the very back?
It's a question going
or
back
was
to
that you before.
A question going back to the early days of the war in Iraq. I had a friend of mine who started many years ago as in Thailand as a journalist for ABC TV. Ended up running ABC TV out of Bangkok and later Reuters, and was in Baghdad when the Reuters office was attacked. About that same time, some weeks later, I was working with a French crew, and again a few weeks later with an Italian crew. Both of units had known friends who had been killed during the early days of the war. My friend who was working for the Thai working for Reuters laterally became a deputy minister of information in Thailand. Now, what was interesting is all the people I worked with were convinced that the attack on Al Jazeera and all the subsequent attacks were organized by a hit squad from the U.S. Army. What is your view of that opinion?
Okay, U.S. Army hit squad on the loose, doing all sorts of mayhem. And last question from you at the back.
Hi, I would like to ask you, as a director of Al Jazeera, the English and the Arabic channel, and from the beginning of the war in Libya, you were too eager to name the fighters, the anti-Gaddafi fighters, as freedom fighters, even showing their flag instead of showing the country's flag on the news. I was just wondering, because you are a journalist, how could you allow for this to happen?
Oh, let's begin with that, because it has a kind of has a juicy feel to it. Were you too ready to recognize the rebels and favor their flag?
We did not actually recognize anyone. I mean, we normally don't recognize anyone. However, we had a team of correspondents in Tripoli. They were banned from traveling, and they have been kicked out immediately. And the three of them were put in jail, for about 55 days. The rebels did allow us to cross the borders between Algeria and Libya and to start working from Benghazi. So what happened? Our temporary office actually started to broadcast from Benghazi. And our coverage of the events became very much centered in Benghazi. Although Al Jazeera English was allowed to have a correspondent in Tripoli, and we continued on a daily basis reporting many times from Tripoli, but of course a lot of constraints were put on the movement of our correspondents there. So the issue is practically on the ground, yes, we have been admitted to areas where the rebels liberated, and then we were allowed to film freely and to move around, and we did show more images from these territories than we did show from
What about this
Tripoli.
flag business? She seems to have something there.
The flag, we show it when the people carry it, but we officially, we're not the United Nations. We did not acknowledge anyone. Yeah.
Okay, now, if the U.S. Army did have a hit squad that managed to knock off hacks, it would be the most organized thing they ever achieved in Iraq, wouldn't it?
Now, I have no doubt, after studying this case tremendously, I have no doubt that the bombing of our bureau in Baghdad was deliberate.
Right. Deliberate.
What deliberate?
Yeah.
No doubt about that. But the issue is how it was done. Was it by, we know for sure that it was hit by, by a tank, and it was very accurate, and they wanted really to hit although we gave them the what you call it, the coordination, but I think it was deliberate to send a message to Al Jazeera. Reuters, maybe. I'm not sure, really. I have not.
Floor of a 14-story. Yeah. It was on the 11th floor of a 14-story building, and they only had a suite.
Yeah.
Odd that a random shell should hit that.
Yeah.
Okay, a changed role for women, is there evidence?
It is already changing. I mean, we have now in the parliament of Tunisia 42 ladies, 47 or 49. 49 ladies, 42 coming from the Islamic Party in Tunisia. So the role of women actually is changing. Now the question is, there is tradition and culture, and that will take some time. I mean, people, in order to acknowledge, in Yemen, you know, I mean, this is amazing. Yemen was the most traditional country in the Arab world as far as women are concerned. But during the revolution, we have seen women or female leaders of the revolution.
Have you met the Nobel Prize winner?
Not yet, actually.
Oh, she's absolutely out of this world. Tremendous, amazing woman.
And that is in Yemen.
Yeah, 32 years old.
Exactly.
And Mandela, yes, Arab is Mandela, is the one.
We have never had leaders. I mean, the concept of leader did not exist in the Arab world. So maybe now, amongst this new generation and the guys who liberated us from the past, yes, we will have many Mandelas, I'm sure. But give us some time to discover them.
Let's end where we began then. Is post your tenure, is the flame flickering, the journalistic drive?
Al Jazeera cannot easily change the way that it is doing the business. It's almost, you know, if Al Jazeera does so, it will be noticed immediately. Our audience are highly politicized and sensitive. Any change in the editorial policy is going to be spotted, and you know, the price of it is going to be very expensive. And therefore, I do not really expect change in the editorial policy. And I think the team that Al Jazeera has established during the last 15 years, and the code of ethics and code of conduct and professional standards and the expectations of the public will be the guardian of the integrity of our reporting. I'm not sure that really Al Jazeera could, you know, easily change. You should not underestimate to what extent the Arab world is, you know, passionate about Al Jazeera. You know, and I don't think Al Jazeera can sacrifice its credibility and integrity for any reason. So the answer is yes, I am confident that the editorial policy, and so far it is continuing as usual, and I think Al Jazeera will continue as usual.
Wadah Khanfar, what an amazing evening. I mean, a really wonderful depth, incredible breadth. We have ranged over some of the most complicated issues and parts of the Arab world and people and places. And I think we're all incredibly grateful to you for your lightness of touch as well, laced with a sense of humor, which is much needed in these troubling circumstances. So thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.